You can totally keep this. Would you like this?
Yeah, I think need that. Yeah.
For sure. Do you have a preference? So I can sit in the middle. I can sit over here. Whatever.
Yeah, why don't you sit in the middle? That might make sense.
That's
Glaring at each other or anything?
Now we have to pretend to be serious people.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Only for 2 hours. Only for the recording.
Is there a time on the comments you wanted to limit to? Like 10
to 15.
10?
Yeah.
That should be plenty. Yeah.
Should be.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to our debate for this evening entitled Theism and the Problem of Evil, hosted by the Houston Institute. My name is James Prather. I'm the Director of Operations here at the Houston Institute, and I run the literature side of things. So this is all the airtime I'll get. But before we get into the philosophical fisticuffs, Texas edition here, I did want to say a few words about what the Houston Institute is and what we do. So we are an academic nonprofit that's aimed at helping the students, and this includes undergraduate, graduate, medical students, as well as faculty, think deeply about the best way to live. We do this primarily through weekly reading groups, through our own philosophical and literary research, but also through big public debates and events and lectures like this. So this is why we're here tonight, obviously. I wanted, those are broad descriptions. So to give you a brief glimpse of what it looks like on a weekly basis, we have a Tuesday philosophy reading group. We have a Thursday literature reading group for students, and then we'll have kind of usually on a weekly basis have mentorship meetings and whatnot, and then we'll also do a semesterly big event like this where we either fly a speaker in or we'll have a debate like we see tonight. So, and I think it's good to think of it as far as numbers. So last semester we had, it was 35 student events with about 80 unique students attending those events. And I should say for this audience that we have salons or kind of reading group for adults on a monthly basis during the school year as well. And at the heart of all of that, of all the researching and teaching, I think is questions. So the questions big and small, perennial and personal, and ancient and contemporary. And so this often leads us beyond ideological lines. It often spans the political divides that we see today, and even works across time, from Nietzsche to Aristotle, from Seamus Heaney to Sappho. And that's why we're here tonight. Tonight's no different, right? I know for a fact that there's people of all different political stripes here. There's people of all different religions here. And I know that this question that we're considering tonight is personal for many people as well. And that question is a classic one, right? It's the problem of evil, which is namely, can an all-good, all-powerful God allow such horrible suffering, the suffering we see all around us and the suffering we've seen throughout history? So I have full confidence that our debate participants will get us closer to grasping and wrestling with that question, and that's what we're about, is taking those questions closer to what is true and to what is beautiful ultimately. So before I introduce them, I would like to say on your programs, you have there's a QR code in the back, and it has a poll. Once we go into Q&A, though, that's where you'll scan that to actually enter questions and whatnot. So I'll take it as a Slido poll. Cool. All right. First up, we have Robert Koons. Robert Koons is a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin, where he has taught for 35 years. He has an MA from Oxford University and a PhD from UCLA. He is the author or co-author of 5 books, including his most recent book, Is Thomas Aquinas' Philosophy of Nature obsolete? He's the co-editor of 4 volumes, most recently Classical Theism from Rutledge. Generally, he has been working recently on an Aristotelian interpretation of quantum theory, on defending and articulating Thomism in contemporary terms, and on arguments for classical theism. On the other side, we have Luis Oliveira. He is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Houston. He received his PhD from UMass Amherst in 2016. He has published numerous articles in the fields of epistemology, philosophy of religion, and ethics, and has edited 4 books, most recently, Kornblith and His Critics from Wiley-Blackwell Press. In 2022, he won the University of Houston's Award for Excellence in Research, Scholarship, and Creative Activity. In between them is our moderator for this evening, our very own Victor Saenz. He is the executive director at the Houston Institute. He received his PhD from Rice University in 2018. He is currently a lecturer in the Rice Philosophy Department, and his academic work has appeared in Apeiron, Ancient Philosophy Today, and the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy. He is currently working on a series of academic articles on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. He also serves as a bioethics scholar at the Paul Ramsey Institute. Victor, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. Delighted to be with you all here. So my role is just to act as a go-between, or as a kind of midwife, as it were, for a lot of the philosophy that we're going to be hearing tonight. So just to give you a sense for the rules of engagement for tonight. So we'll start with Professor Koons giving us the opening salvo. Professor Koons will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. Then we'll have Professor Oliveira giving his own view, also speaking for 20 to 25 minutes. Then we'll have each of them, Koons, then Oliveira, replying to each other's arguments for 10 to 15 minutes. Right, so they've read each other's work, they've been thinking about this, so that we should get some really thoughtful exchanges. And after that, we'll be turning it over to you all. So we'll have a period of Q&A. So Q is for Q&A, Q is for QR code. So by the time that rolls around, be sure to be scanning the back for our ability to submit questions, so be sure to be looking at that. So let me hand it over to Professor Rob Koons.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Victor. Thanks to the Houston Institute for the invitation to come. I'm a native Houstonian, and I've got 3 kids, actually 3 grandkids just living down the street. So when Victor asked me to come to Houston and give a talk, I said, sure, twist my arm. Wasn't that hard. So happy to be here and happy to participate in this real important discussion. So I'm going to approach this. I'm personally a Christian, so a lot of my answers are going to presuppose a kind of Christian perspective, but I think many of them could be adapted for other traditions. My Jewish and Muslim friends, I think Hindu friends might well agree with a lot of what I have to say, but I just want to let you know, just to preface where I'm going to come from. So let's see. It was working a minute ago. Oh, maybe I hit something wrong. There we go. Okay, right. So I'm going to go through 9 questions about why God allows suffering. Try to get to the main issue here. So let's just start with the first obvious one. Why didn't God create a world that was full of happiness and devoid of pain? So we're going to be obviously asking about what is implied by God's being good and being morally good. And that's going to involve our asking what does it mean to be morally good, right? So we need some sort of a theory or conception of what moral goodness consists in. It seems to me that if we're going to address this in a religious context, that means looking at the conceptions of ethics that you will find among religious believers, and in my case, among Christians in particular. So one view of ethics is that the morally good person is one who produces as much happiness as possible and as little pain as possible. By that model, it doesn't look like God's doing a great job. It doesn't seem like a particularly morally good person. But that's not the ethical theory that I personally favor. My worry is that that's often called a utilitarian kind of perspective. And it assumes that God is looking at some kind of global outcome. So his point is to produce a maximum amount of happiness as a sum total. And from that perspective, individual people don't matter so much. We become just little containers of happiness. And God's just interested in filling up, getting as much happiness out there as possible, and isn't really cared about us as individuals. So from a more Christian perspective, I think we shouldn't look at it in terms of God being a total happiness maximizer. That's the wrong way to think about it. Another reason why I think it's inappropriate in God's case is that God is already perfectly happy without even creating anything at all. In fact, infinitely happy. So there's infinite happiness in God himself. No amount of creating other creatures is going to increase the total amount of happiness in that sense. So that's just not the reasonable kind of thing to apply to God. So instead, from a Christian perspective, he's a God of love, agape. That is, it's love for individuals, right, not aggregate quantities. He loves his creatures as individuals and not just part of a whole, right? So that's an important kind of preconception. But then we could ask, well, okay, so let's switch to talking about love for individuals, right? If God loves us as individuals, why doesn't he prevent the suffering of the individual creatures that he creates? Why does he allow me or you or our friends to suffer if he loves us, right? God is committed to creating a world, right? That's the basic thing, I think. That is, he's involved in creating a world in which there are more than one creatures, right, who are distinct from him and who have their own natures, right? And it's good from God's point of view that there should be creatures and that they should have a nature of their own. That is, God is not interested in just creating a kind of shadow boxing sort of situation where there are no real creatures, there's just God himself, manipulating things on a screen. He's interested instead in creating actual things. And this necessarily involves putting constraints on his own action. So there's no way that God can create a world full of creatures with their own powers and natures and then just make those creatures do in each case exactly what he wants them to do instead of respecting the natures and the powers that he's given to them as individuals. So any divine intervention has to be the exception, not the rule. This is oftentimes this is put in terms of something like the free will defense, that if God is going to create us and give us free will, then he has to allow us to exercise that free will as we wish and not to intervene constantly to prevent things from happening. So if I want to insult somebody, God doesn't check to see whether what I'm saying is insulting and sort of stop the words in mid-flight, so to speak, because that would be a failure to respect my free will. But I think it can actually generalize more fully than that. So even if God had not created rational creatures with free will, but just living creatures, cats and dogs and so on, you would have had to create them with a nature. And that nature would mean, again, that the cat and the dog and the squirrel and so on would have to do their doggy thing or the squirrely thing in each particular case, not simply acting as God would wish on each particular occasion. And even in an inorganic world, a world of just stars and galaxies and so on, there's still going to be a nature there, a certain set of powers, which will result in events, galaxies colliding and so on, which produce results that are consequences of those particular natures. Now you might think, well, okay, if that's the case, if God is committed to sustaining this kind of a world full of creatures with their own natures, then does that mean that I'm saying that any kind of miracle or intervention is impossible, right? So in other words, do I have to swing all the way to a kind of deism picture of God, where God creates a world, gives it certain kinds of laws of nature or nature's built into those creatures, and then just sort of steps back and lets things happen without any kind of activity on his own part? I don't think that does follow, but it's important that the interventions or the miracles would always be an exception rather than a rule, right? So that when God does intervene, it would have to be for some special reason, not simply because he wants to prevent suffering or because what's being done is again contrary to his preferences. It has to be something, for instance, something to do with the history of revelation, something to do with the role of a prophet or the incarnation of God in the case of Christ, not simply for the sake of preventing pain or suffering to the creatures. There has to be some further justification. Now, I also want to clarify something about human suffering and death, because one might think that from what I've said so far, that human suffering and death are just parts of human nature, and so there's nothing really wrong with them, right? They're just part of the world that God has created, and so there's no particular reason for God to be interested even in stopping suffering or death on the part of human beings. And I want to say, again, looking at this from a Christian sort of theological perspective, I want to clarify that, at least from my perspective, God didn't intend for human beings to die at all, right? The original intention was for us to be immortal and not to be subject to any kind of illness or suffering or death. And this was, I think, a special case for human beings as opposed to other creatures. But human beings abuse their free will in lots of ways, producing moral evils in the world. And in that kind of context, death is actually a qualified good thing, a blessing in a sense, right? Because you try to just imagine a world in which human beings were able to exercise cruelty towards each other, but there's no death, right? So you could torture someone forever, right? And there would never be death to either deliver the victim from that torture or to end the tyranny of the abuser. So death is important as a way of sort of limiting the evil that we can do to each other through the exercise of free will. A world with moral evil and no death would be far worse. But nonetheless, suffering and death are not themselves good things, and there's reason to hope, from a Christian perspective again, that God would provide a way of overcoming death, right? And we just went through the Easter season, right? So Easter is all about God in Christ conquering death and opening up for the possibility of an eternal life. Right? That's because death was not originally part of his plan. So I could still ask, but why, if the world has been messed up by human beings, right? And so the world is fallen as a result of that. Why, if God loves us, did he put us into the context of such a fallen world, a corrupted world? Why not, if he really loved me, why wouldn't he have put me in a world where things worked much better, where there wasn't moral evil, where I could prosper, right? Why me, if he really loves me? So this is a subtle point, which I hope I can try to get across. The question here is, if we're asking about God's love for me as an individual, or for you as an individual, right? We've got to ask, could God have put us in a world in which, a better world? Could he have put me in a better world, right? So in other words, the fact that he might have created a different world, which was better, is sort of irrelevant to the question about whether he loves me, right? To love me would be to put me in a better situation. Right? So I've had some problems with my back, for instance, and I might sometimes think, God, why didn't you create a world where the human backbone isn't so messed up, so we don't have these kind of back issues, right? But I think it's not really a sensible question, because if God had created a different world where where not human beings, but another creature appeared on Earth with a different kind of backbone that was much better than ours, that might be good for them, but it's not good for me, right? Because I wouldn't exist in such a world. My personal identity is really tied up with the kind of world that we live in. So the question is not, it really doesn't make sense to ask, if God loved me, why he didn't put me in a different sort of world. The question is, how has he shown his love for me in this world, in the kind of world that he created, with the sort of nature that's around us, right? I mean, I was born after World War II, after the Korean War, right? Those were terrible things. Lots of people suffered. If God had created a world where there was no moral evil and no suffering like this, it might have been a better world, but it wouldn't have been a world that contained me, because my identity is sort of tied up with the kinds of conditions in which I came to exist. And even if you doubt that, and you think, well, maybe it's metaphysically possible, right, for Rob Coons to appear in this other world where everything's better, the life that person, that Rob Coons, would have lived would be so alien to the life I actually have led that, again, it doesn't really make sense to say that love for me would have actualized that other world instead of this world. Helen Keller, lived a life of when she was blind and deaf, and someone asked her in an interview once whether she was upset with God for not having created her, with hearing and sight from the beginning. And she said, well, no, because I can't even imagine, being without blindness and deafness. She valued the sort of life that she had that was tied up with her identity. And it wouldn't have made sense for someone to look at that and say a greater love for her would have put her in a radically different kind of situation. So it doesn't make sense to ask why God didn't create us, the very people we are, in a better world, because we wouldn't have existed under those other circumstances. And again, remember, we're not expecting God to maximize the total quantity of happiness abstractly. We're asking, does he love us as individuals, right? And that's going to presuppose the kind of context in which we exist. So why did God create us at all, knowing that so many of us would suffer and others would turn to evil? Why not just pick a different sort of world altogether, right? Here we get into some very deep issues, I think. So again, if we're going to evaluate God's moral goodness, we have to be able to find things that God does or has done that are close enough parallels to things that we could do or have done, that there's a reasonable sort of comparison, right? So if God appears and speaks to us in a human language, that's pretty close to the sorts of things that you and I do, right? And so we could expect that that God would not lie in that circumstance, just as a good human person wouldn't lie, right? Or if God became a human being and lived among us in Nazareth several thousand years ago, we would expect his actions to demonstrate kind of compassion and kindness that you and I would show. Right? But when we're talking about the creation of the world from nothingness, the very initial act in which the creation takes the shape in which it does, this is an action that's completely alien to anything that you and I could even imagine doing. It's an entirely different sort of action. And so it's not at all clear that any sort of human moral categories would apply in that case. God's not under any prior obligations or responsibilities or relationships, right? So again, God is a God of love. Without the creation, from a Trinitarian point of view, there were the three persons of the Trinity who loved each other. There were no other people to love in that kind of situation, right? So it wouldn't make sense to say that this sort of one creation or another would exercise or would exemplify love for creatures, right? Because there are no creatures yet in the picture, right? So we can't even apply the categories of love to the creation. We can only ask how God's actions subsequent to creation display his kindness and goodness, right? So we have to say God creates a world with certain kinds of constraints and natures and powers in that world, right? He puts creatures in that world, and now we can ask, how does he respond within that context? What does he do to show us his love and his kindness in that sort of context? Now, why didn't God just create a better world, right? Why create, again, this so imperfect sort of world in the first place, right? Well, of course, he did create a better world from a Christian perspective. There are these superhuman beings, angels. Some of them never fell into sin at all. They just lived lives of perfect happiness and goodness and virtue. So he could have just stopped there. Right? He could have just created those angels and none others. Why didn't he do that? The basic question is why not? Right? Why not, in addition to them, also create us, even though, despite our fallibility, despite our proneness to sin and so on? In fact, for all we know, there could be an infinity of alternative worlds. I mean, people talk a lot about these days about a multiverse, the possibilities of many different universes. It's quite possible that God did create a huge number of universes, and in many of those universes, things might be much better than here. Why not create this world in addition, right? It looks as though as long as this world is better than nothing, right? As long as it just gets over the line of minimally acceptable sort of universe, there's a reason for God to create it in addition to all the other worlds that he creates, right? There's no reason why he had to stop with the best or the one of the best possible worlds. But when I say, but wait a minute, don't the imperfections of this world, I'm granting there are imperfections in this world, right? Doesn't that reflect somehow an imperfection in God himself? Right? If God creates an imperfect world, doesn't that mean God's imperfect himself? Wouldn't that contradict some sort of a theism? And I think no, actually. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's precisely because God is infinite in perfection that we should expect a highly imperfect creation. Why is that? Well, given God's infinity, right, there's no such thing as a best possible world that God could do, right? I mean, for you and me, it sort of makes sense in certain cases to do your best, right? When you're on your test, do your best. As a teacher, do your best. We can't really ask God to do his best. There's no such thing. He's infinite, right? So no matter how good a world he created, there'd always be a still better world that he could have created in addition to it, right? So in fact, that particular issue doesn't make any sense. Whereas if God were only a finite creator, then it would make sense to say God must do his best. And then we could ask, well, if this is the best he could do, he's not very good, right? But in the case of God, who's infinite, that inference doesn't work because it doesn't make any sense for him to do his best. There's no such thing as his best. So he's going to create a good world. All we can expect is that this world be a good world. Not a best world, not a perfect world, not a world that couldn't be any better, but just a good world. And it is a good world, I think, in general. So this is, again, I'm pushing the boundaries here a little bit. I don't want this to be sound impious, but there's a sense in which, given God's infinity, there's a kind of indolence on the part of God, right? That is, since God can do anything, right, and he's capable of anything, it doesn't make sense to ask God, why didn't you do this other good thing, right? Because there's so many things he could have done, right? All of which are good, all of which are better and better and better, and which are in conflict with each other. So God doesn't need a reason not to do anything. In fact, if you think about it, it makes sense that God can't have a reason not to do most of the things he doesn't do, nearly all the things he doesn't do, right? Because there's so many things he could do, right? That it doesn't make any sense. I mean, even for us, right, I don't think we in general need reasons not to do things. I mean, it's not like you wake up in the morning and think, let me write down all the possible things I could do and make sure I've got a reason not to do each of the ones I don't do. That's not the way we do things, right? And in God's case, it really doesn't make any sense for him to do that. He's always going to do what's good, and often amazingly good, but it never makes sense to ask God, why didn't you do better? Why didn't you do more? Right? To expect an answer to that question is just unreasonable. In many cases, there just is no answer as to why he didn't do more, why he didn't do better. So it makes sense then for us to try to give God special reasons for actualizing particular goods. So it makes sense for us to engage in things like petitionary prayer, because if we pray for things, that gives God additional reasons to do something, right? So it's not just that he does it because he didn't have a reason not to, but we actually give him additional reasons to do something. But of course, there's limits to this. There's no guarantees. And obviously, God can't just hand over control of the universe to each of us and do whatever we ask. But it makes sense, nonetheless, for us to do what we can to give him additional reasons to do good things that otherwise he might not do. So God is constrained to respect these natures because of his infinity. And as a result, in many cases, it's up to us to fight against suffering. Right? So the suffering that happens is not there because God chose it to be there. Right? It's there because he just didn't eliminate the suffering. He left it to us to fight against it. So if we do fight against it, I think that will give God reason to cooperate with us and to bless our efforts. But it solves the problem, the dilemma posed in Camus' The Plague. How can we fight the plague without opposing God's will? It's not really God's will that the plague should go on, right? It's not that God has some reason not to stop the plague. He just didn't have a reason not to do so. And so it makes sense for us to fight the plague and to hope for God's help in overcoming it. So again, in calling God indolent, I'm not, of course, denying that he's done amazing things for us. I think he has. But I think it's important for us not to focus on the things he hasn't done. God showers many good things on us all daily. Much we take for granted. And as Christians, we think he took the extraordinary step of assuming human nature, becoming a man, living and dying for us in order to overcome our separation from him. So it's a supreme act, really, of love for us, opening up for us the hope of eternal life. So finally, what positive meaning can suffering have for us? God conquered evil through suffering, through the suffering of his son Jesus on the cross. Primary thing here, I think, was for him to become a human being to reveal to us what he's like, but for God to genuinely reveal what he's like in a world like ours, where there's so much sin and evil, would mean for him to suffer, right? Because that's what happens to really righteous people in this world. And so to fulfill that task of revealing himself fully, it was important for him to endure that kind of suffering. It's not a shock to Christians to find out that terrible things happen to innocent people. Right? The whole religion is about worshiping a man to whom terrible things happened, right? And we can participate in God's warfare with evil, both through patiently enduring suffering and by acting compassionately to end it. And finally, we can have hope for eternal life, free from pain and suffering, in which this original creative intention of God can be fulfilled. Stop there. Great. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Koons. We'll have Professor Oliveira up next.
So thank you, Victor, for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be sharing the stage with Professor Koons. Thank you for that presentation. I want to begin by pointing out that there's no such thing as the problem of evil. So debate is over, we can go home. No, what I mean is that there's no such thing as the problem of evil, right? There's just a variety of arguments. There's a variety of different targets. There's a variety of different concerns that are raised and so on. And I think Rob did a great job at giving us a tour of various different questions. My approach is going to be different. I'm going to try to very carefully articulate one version and go deep into why some concerns about evil can be thought of as legitimate. So here's two well-known examples of versions of the problem of evil. We have the logical problem of evil that more recently was articulated by Mackey. This is maybe the more traditional version, where the idea is that the mere existence of evil seems to be inconsistent with the existence of a good God. In the logical sense, it just could not possibly be the case that God exists and evil exists. A different version, a more modest version, we have the evidential problem of evil, articulated by William Rowe more recently as well, suggesting just that maybe some kinds of evil that we don't understand how that or why that would exist, that can be a reason for thinking that God doesn't exist. There are other versions as well. There's an abductive version of the problem of evil articulated recently by Paul Draper, but traced back to David Hume, suggesting that the existence of a God that is not a perfect God is the best explanation for the evil that we see in the world, and so on. But I'm going to try to present something different tonight than these more well-known, more traditional versions of the problem of evil. I'm happy to talk about those as well. My strategy is going to be the same or very similar. I'm going to try to show that some things that hopefully you already believe, some things that you find plausible, lead to a result that you yourself can recognize as a problem. You yourself will be gripped by and think that there's something problematic here, something I need to suss out and figure out how to solve. So if I succeed, then the interesting question is what to do about the problem. That's not the end of the conversation, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so I want to start by getting clear about what kind of God I'm talking about. So the kind of God I'm talking about, I'm giving you a definition here. God is a person-like being who is not only omnipotent and omnibenevolent, but also loves and personally cares for each of the creatures made in his image, and does so in ways that are not entirely different from the ways in which we ourselves love and care for those around us. I'm not assuming that this view of God is the correct definition. I'm not assuming that this view of God is necessarily an accurate description of the biblical God. I'm not assuming that this is the most sophisticated understanding theologically of God and so on. I'm focusing on it simply because it's a popular view of God. It's a view of God that I grew up believing in, is a view of God that I think many of you might have. And I think it's a view that is fitting for those who claim to trust and love and have faith in God, right? And I think that's a natural thing to accept. So here's why. Here's a series of rhetorical questions. Why would you trust and love a God that does not love and personally care for you in particular? Or why would you trust and love a God that loves and personally cares for you, but in a sense that is entirely disconnected from how you understand what it means to love and care for someone, right? Or why would you call God good if he does not love and care for some of the creatures that he himself created in his image? Or again, why would you call that God good if he does love and care for those creatures, but in some sense completely disconnected from what you think of love and care and so on and so forth, right? So in my view, talk about God's goodness and talk of our attitude of love and trust towards God, especially on account of his goodness and of his love and his care, seems to imply an underlying commitment to something like this view of God, right? So that's why I'm focusing on that kind of view. Now, if that view of God is true, then I think something like this claim that I'm calling reasons is true as well. God has justifying moral reasons for allowing every instance of evil in the world. Everything horrible that happens, God has a reason for allowing it. We're thinking here of a God, remember, who loves and personally cares for each of his creatures. And he does that in ways that are not entirely different from the ways in which we love and care for those around us. if you reject this claim now, this claim that I'm calling reasons, then you think that it makes sense for God, that loving God, to say something like this to a victim of horrifying evils. And I'm going to quote this hypothetical God. I see you, and I love and care for you personally, but there's no reason at all why I'm allowing this particular evil that you have suffered. I knew of it in advance. I could have prevented it if I wanted to. I had no reason not to prevent it, no aims to achieve by allowing it, no greater goals in mind. But I did nothing. So I don't know, but to me, that sounds like conceptual confusion about love and care. We wouldn't think that a parent who acts in this way, who knows of some suffering, can do something about the suffering, has no reason whatsoever to not prevent the suffering or to allow the suffering, is somehow acting as a loving or caring parent. That, to me, doesn't make sense. So even more of a God of unlimited resources. So if we're thinking of God as this personal God that loves and cares you in particular, it seems to me that this claim is true as well. Now, of course, to say that we believe that God has a justifying reason for every evil he allows is not the same as saying that we can know what that justifying reason is for each and every case. I'm capturing that with this claim that I'm calling opacity. We have no clue what are God's justifying moral reasons for an overwhelmingly large number of the instances of evil when you look throughout history that he has allowed. And we may have some interesting ideas about why God would allow evil to exist in general, right? That's the stuff of theodicies. That's the stuff of defenses. But the mysteriousness of God's ways when it comes to particular cases has been a central part of theistic tradition for a very long time. Again, the book of Job is a great example of this tradition of not, a series of conversations where friends like these of Job are trying to tell him why he is suffering in these ways, and all those suggestions are misguided. But the idea that I'm calling opacity here is not just traditional. It seems to me exactly right if you're thinking of the kind of God that we're talking about. When we consider some of the horrifying things that some people have been through in this world, denying this claim seems to me intellectually hubristic and seems morally myopic. Now, since I'm the one who's presenting and defending the problem of evil here, I'm contractually obligated to bring up some horrifying example of evil in the world. So if you don't want to hear something about horrible things happening to children, you can plug your ears for a couple minutes. But I just want to mention as an example here some of the horrific descriptions in the British Royal Commission report on the employment of children in mines from the 1840s. This is a report commissioned by the government on the employment of children in mines, not away, not outside of England, but in England at that time. So the report tells us that children as young as 4, 5, 6 years of age, think of your child or some kid of that age that you know, would spend entire days alone and in total darkness inside small passageways in the middle of the mine in conditions that the report calls solitary confinement of the worst order. There's a picture on the top of a child spending their entire days like that. Some children as young as 4, 5, 6 years of age would drag and push carts filled with coal through passageways so small that they had to crawl on their hands and feet in conditions the report says were not fit for human beings to work in. There's a picture of that as well. The mining children were so tired by their toil that they often had to be led or carried home from the pits and usually fell asleep before they could be put to bed. They became dwarfed, bow-legged, crippled, and otherwise deformed, suffered from curvature of the spine, abscesses and boils on their heads from pushing the coal tubs with it. They contracted heart trouble through excessive exertion, lung trouble through the lack of ventilation in the mines, eye trouble, rheumatism, boils from working in salt water, rupture and disease of the glands and joints. These were kids that were 4, 5, 6 years old. So if you believe in the kind of God that I described above, the kind of God that personally cares and loves for each of these children, then you must believe that he had a justifying reason for allowing this to happen. Right? But if you're even just moderately well-adjusted, then I don't think you can pretend to understand what could possibly be God's reasons for allowing this. Right? So in this and many other cases, I think God's ways are just beyond us. Right? What was the reason for this? We just don't know. Right? That's what opacity is all about. Okay, so for all these reasons, I think this package of views is not only very popular, but also extremely well motivated for anyone who trusts and loves and has faith in God. I'm not pretending to have identified views that are essential to theism or essential to Christianity. You can be a Christian and not have those beliefs. I'm just saying that this package is characteristic of a whole lot of theists and a whole lot of Christians, and rightly so. It makes sense to have this package together, right? Now, obviously, I'm mentioning this because I think this package is filled with tensions as well. And I want to talk about one of those tensions tonight as a version of the problem of evil. So what I want to do is I want to draw your attention to what it means to ascribe values and concerns to someone. So I want to identify two features of our ordinary practice of ascribing values and concerns to someone. The first is the connection to concrete expectations. So suppose I think that Janet, this is Janet. Suppose I think that Janet cares about organic gardening and loves native plants. If that's what I think of her, then I expect a bunch of stuff from her. I expect that she will try to garden when she can, that she will prefer native plants over non-native plants, that she will talk about gardening and about the importance of avoiding harsh chemicals when she gets a chance. I expect that she will be attentive to and informed about such things as rain levels, sunlight exposure, soil nutrition, labeling practices and regulations, and so on. The point is, I am not ascribing values and concerns to someone if I think that anything they might do next is equally likely. When I say that Janet loves gardening, I genuinely expect that she won't yell, "Gardening is for losers," when I ask her advice about my garden. Right? I have expectations about what she would do. That's why I would be surprised if she yelled that at me. Now, the second feature of our ordinary practice of ascribing values and concerns to someone is the related connection to the search for hindsight coherence. Suppose I find out that Janet has been spraying extremely toxic herbicides on her garden, or that she hasn't tended to her garden in months, or that she tends to carelessly walk all over her neighbor's flowers when she goes over for a chat, and so on. Then I would start looking for explanations for these behaviors. Explanations that allow me to make sense of them from the perspective of the values and concerns that I ascribe to her. I would be looking for her justifying reasons. Is there something about these circumstances that I'm missing? Why would someone who cares about organic gardening and loves native plants do all that? Since ascribing values and concerns is partly a matter of having concrete expectations, maintaining those ascriptions is partly a matter of making sense of the failed expectations. Overall, then, ascribing values and concerns to someone is a dynamic normative practice characterized by a fluid interplay between the setting of concrete expectations and the search for hindsight coherence when too many of those expectations are not met. It's a normative practice because we take values and concerns to impose constraints on people's behaviors. That's the expectation part. We're surprised when they do some things when we ascribe some values to them. But it's a dynamic and fluid practice because there's room for flexibility and adjustment. You don't simply abandon your ascription when you see something that doesn't fit. You look for reasons, there's flexibility, and so on. But human psychology is complex. I don't need to belabor that point. And human relations are organic and resilient. So the reality is that this practice can withstand a lot of pressure and it can build up a lot of tension. In fact, it's perfectly possible for us, and unfortunately, it's not entirely uncommon, to be in relationships that suffer from what I will call reflective, normative unintelligibility. This happens when we are aware of too many choices on someone's part that we cannot make sense of from the perspective of the very values and concerns that we ascribe to them. This is different from simply not getting why someone would have different values and concerns from us, and even different from not getting why someone would have horrible values and concerns. Reflective normative unintelligibility is an internal tension that is caused by holding on to our own ascriptions of values and concerns whose concrete expectations are repeatedly unmet and which repeatedly resist reintegration through hindsight coherence by identifying justifying reasons. This typically happens because of an exaggerated reliance on the possibility that justifying reasons might exist, even though we just can't see them, right? They might have a reason why they're doing this. There might be some explanation. But when this builds up for too long or for too many cases, that's not good, right? It's a relational pathology. That's why we commonly advise or criticize friends and even strangers, celebrities and so on, when we perceive them to be in relationships suffering from reflective normative unintelligibility. Okay, so I think we can now see the problem that I want to outline tonight. To say that God loves us and personally cares for each of the creatures that were made in his image and does so in ways that are not entirely different from the ways in which we ourselves love and care for those around us is to set down concrete expectations for God's behavior. The same kinds of expectations connected to our other descriptions of love and care. We're not genuinely ascribing these values and concerns to God if we think that anything God might do next is equally likely. That's not what ascribing values and concerns to someone is. So when my wife tells my son, "Don't be afraid, God is with you," she genuinely expects that God won't let something horrible happen to him today. But by our own admission, we have no clue how an overwhelmingly large number of the unexpected events we know he has allowed fit with those values that we ascribe to him. We can see that they're logically consistent with those values, sure, but we cannot reintegrate them through hindsight coherence by identifying his justifying reasons. So my suggestion, of course, is that this is not good. It's another understandable but regrettable case of a fairly typical and ordinary relational pathology. Oh, don't worry, of course, I'm here to kindly and respectfully help you out of it. Jokes aside, of course. So I hope this feels like a legitimate concern. The problem arises out of views and positions that you, I think, find plausible, and it's connected to an issue that I think seems concerning, at least when not applied to God. But I also want to say something further about why this is a problem. Sort of bring out some specific reasons to think that the fact that our relationship to God suffers from reflective normative unintelligibility is a serious concern, not just intuitively, but more precisely. So, first, I want to suggest that if your relationship to someone suffers from reflective normative unintelligibility, then it's inappropriate for you to trust that person. I'm not suggesting that it's only appropriate to trust someone if you have first checked to see if you can make good sense of their track record. What I'm saying is that if you take yourself to be unable to understand them, then that information undermines the background conditions that make trusting them appropriate. Why? Because trust is connected to expectations as well. If you trust me to keep your secret, then you expect me to keep your secret. And if I repeatedly spill your secrets for reasons you cannot understand, then you're a fool if you continue to trust me. So similarly, if your relationship to God suffers from reflective normative unintelligibility, trusting God is inappropriate. So I'm not saying that God has in fact failed to be loving and caring. He may not have failed in any way at all. Of course, he may have justifying reasons for everything he has allowed. What I'm saying is that our incapacity to reintegrate God's decisions in hindsight by identifying his reasons turns our unmet expectations into a problem for our trust. So here you might say the problem with all this is the presumption that we can have any legitimate expectations of a perfect God at all, right? How hubristic to suggest this. But notice that a central part of my point tonight is that this is really not a presumption. This is a condition of ascribing values to and of trusting God in the first place. At least if we're doing that in ways that are not entirely different from the ways that we typically do those things. Okay. Second, I want to suggest that if you're in a relationship with someone that suffers from reflective normative unintelligibility, then it is recklessly dangerous for you to trust them. Trusting is always somewhat dangerous. Trusting always involves placing something you care about in someone else's hands. Trusting involves what Annette Bayer famously called accepted vulnerability to another's possible but not expected ill will. This is what's beautiful and ennobling about trust, and this is what distinguishes failures of trust as betrayals in particular. But trusting someone who has repeatedly behaved in ways that you cannot understand is more than dangerous. It's reckless. It's irresponsible. In fact, placing someone you love or care for in the hands of someone whose behavior you cannot square with the values and concerns you ascribe to them is a failure on your part to properly care and love for them. So consider a contrast in this regard as an example. So from the perspective of my talk tonight, Abraham's story is a paradigm of reflective normative unintelligibility. Abraham ascribes to God love and care for him and for his son Isaac. Abraham does not understand how those values and concerns fit with the request that he sacrifice Isaac as a burnt offering. From Abraham's perspective, from the perspective of his understanding of what it means to love and care for Isaac, sacrificing him in this way makes no sense. It's preposterous. Nonetheless, despite loving and caring for his son, he's willing to act in this preposterous way on account of trusting under conditions of reflective normative unintelligibility. This, in my view, is reckless endangerment of a child. Shame on you, Abraham. The character of Salome in Mirantal's novel Women Talking has a different reaction. She says, I will challenge God on the spot to strike me dead if I have sinned by protecting my child from evil. I will burn forever in hell before I allow another man to satisfy his violent urges with the body of my 4-year-old child. From the perspective of my talk tonight, we can paraphrase her as saying, I don't understand why a God who personally loves and cares for my child like I do has allowed this to happen to them, but I will not cooperate with that unintelligible plan, no matter the cost. I don't know about you, but when I think of my child, I identify with the reaction of the second of these two characters. Okay, so I have suggested that trusting someone under conditions of reflective normative unintelligibility is both inappropriate and recklessly dangerous, especially when you're placing someone else whom you love and care into their unintelligible hands. But the thing is that most accounts of faith see it as just a special case of trust or as having trust as a proper component. So my third and final suggestion is that if it's inappropriate and recklessly dangerous for you to trust someone, then it is also inappropriate and recklessly dangerous for you to have faith in them. If this is right, then the condition of reflective normative unintelligibility affects the appropriateness of faith as well. This is a serious problem, of course, since faith is often a fallback position when we're facing the intellectual difficulties of making sense of evil. We trust that God has his reasons for allowing all the evil that befuddles us. But if trust is inappropriate and faith is inappropriate, then that fallback position goes away. So this is my argument tonight. If someone accepts these three claims about God, which I hope to make plausible, then their relationship to God suffers from reflective normative unintelligibility. If your relationship to God suffers in this way, then it's inappropriate and recklessly dangerous for you to trust and have faith in God. Now, this argument might seem to affect only those who accept the claims that I've defined as God, reasons, and opacity. If you reject any of those, the argument doesn't apply to you. The problem, of course, is that if you claim to trust and love and have faith in God, then it's hard to reject any of these claims without collateral damage. At least that's how things seem to me, and that's the problem of evil, or the version of the problem of evil that I have for you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Oliveira. So we'll hear from Professor Koons for a brief reply.
Yeah, thanks, Luis. That was very clear, very stirring. Appreciate it. Great opportunity for me to weigh in here. Let's see if I can pull up my slides. Actually, before I get to those, let me, here, can I move back at all? Let's see, I don't want to get distracted. There we go. Yeah, I wanted to say a couple things before I get to my eight questions in particular. Agree with a lot of things that Luis had to say. I think that it is important that we say that when we ascribe love and concern to God, that it not be completely different, as he says, from love and concern with human beings. But I'd emphasize the completely different part, right? We do have to take into account the fact that God is a different sort of being than us, and his actions are different from ours. And so there has to be some adjustment that has to be made here. And in particular, let me get to the justifying reasons issue as well, because there's two kinds of justifying reasons that God might have for allowing some evil. One would be, I'm going to allow this evil because it contributes to some other greater good, right? If that's the kind of justifying reason that God has, then I think we're in real trouble, right? Because it means that whenever there's some suffering out there, I have to say, well, who am I to mess with the suffering? Because God's got some further good in mind that he's allowing the suffering to happen for the sake of. So I don't like that kind of theodicy at all. I'm really opposed to those sorts of theodicies entirely. I think there's a different kind of justifying reason, which is God created a world. That's the justifying reason, right? He created a world. Why did these terrible things happen to these children in Britain, right? If it was because God had some further plan in mind, then you would have thought all the good Christians in England would have said, well, let's not do anything about it. Let's continue to let the kids suffer. But instead, if you thought, well, it's because you created a world in which there were people who did bad things to kids, and there's bad facts about coal and rock and water that can hurt kids, that it interferes with their human nature, that gives us a good reason to do something about it, right? So why does God not step in? Because God can't step in at all times. He had to bind himself in creating a world. He had to, in a sense, vow to himself, I will not interfere with this world except in very special circumstances, right? If he doesn't make that kind of vow, then there's no creaturely activity at all that's possible, right? You would be constantly interfering in such a way that none of us could ever do anything, or nothing could ever do anything, right? So that's the justifying reason. It's a very global, sort of simple reason, right? Why does somebody have cancer? Because human beings get cancer. That's part of human nature. It's part of the way the human body works, right? Should we try to fight cancer? Yes, right? And I think that when we do fight these evils, we can trust that God will help us in fighting these evils. And I'll bet if we studied the history of the elimination of these kind of abuses in the British minds, we would find that it was because of religious people who were being helped by grace to fight against these evils more effectively. So in fact, I think if we understand it in those terms, the opacity, in a sense, it disappears. And we instead can see ourselves as cooperating with God in eliminating these sorts of evils. Right? Now, getting back to the parent, I mean, would a parent say, I've got to respect free will, so I'm not going to protect my child from this rapist? Of course not. A good parent, would do all kinds of terrible things to protect their child, right? And I would too, right? But this is where we have to take into account the fact that God is God and not us, right? To ask God to do terrible things, to ask God to violate his own oaths, so to speak, right? To violate his own integrity and start interfering with creation, is to ask God to cease to be God. And that's just an unreasonable expectation on our part. So we have to understand that, yes, God, it's hard for us to understand how God can just stand by and do nothing when these terrible things are happening, right? Apparently do nothing. We would rush in. But that's because we're not God, right? There's a fundamental difference there. Okay, so let me get into some of the nitty-gritty issues here, if I can. There we go. I think Lewis raised some really interesting questions about the nature of trust, right? And I think he and I disagree in a sort of fundamental way about the nature of trust. I actually think that it's quite possible and reasonable and even important to have a kind of absolute evidence-impervious trust, even in other human beings, right? I mean, I think I trust my mother that way, my wife, my kids. If you came up with some kind of evidence, really convincing evidence, my wife had done these terrible things, I would say the evidence has been faked, the witnesses are lying, right? There's no amount of evidence that you can produce for me that will convince me that my wife is anything but a wonderful person, right? And it's good that I have that kind of impervious faith in her. Human society wouldn't be able to function if we weren't capable of that, right? And of course, in the case of God, even more so, right? I've got an evidence-impervious kind of trust in God. That's a good thing, right, I think. Is it recklessly dangerous? No, right? Because unlike all human beings, it's metaphysically impossible for God to do evil, right? So therefore, metaphysically, there's no danger whatsoever in my having a kind of absolute and impervious kind of trust in God. Does suffering in God give us reason to doubt God's existence? I want to skip over this because it didn't really come up in Lewis's talk very much, but I want to skip instead to 4. What should we trust God for, right? Should we trust God, and should I teach my kids to trust God that he will prevent terrible things from happening to them in this life? No, I don't think we should do that, right? Because the Bible actually makes very clear that God has not promised to prevent terrible things from happening to innocent people. In fact, it's happened over and over again in biblical history. So what we should teach instead is that God will keep his promises. That's the crucial thing. That's what you can trust God to do. And so you have to look at the Bible and see specifically what has he promised to do. And he's promised that if we repent, if we believe in him, if we cooperate with his grace, that after this life is over, he will give us eternal life, right, with him. That's what he promised. We can trust him for that. He's also promised that if we ask for his help in our spiritual lives, to make us better persons, to improve our virtue, he will do that. And my own experience is he's trustworthy on that. He keeps that promise. I've seen that happen in my life over and over again. So I don't trust him to prevent terrible things from happening to me or others because he's told us he won't prevent those things from happening. So it's not a lack of trust at all in that case. We should trust God only when he's promised us to do something. What do we gain by distrusting God? Very little, I think, right? Suppose God exists and he's untrustworthy. Suppose that hypothetically. Is it dangerous for me to trust him in that circumstance? Well, we're screwed. If there's an untrustworthy God, it doesn't matter whether we trusted him or not. He's going to do terrible things to us, right? So we actually don't gain anything much by distrusting God if he's untrustworthy, right? Suppose he's trustworthy and we distrust him. Well, then we lose a lot, right? So as you can see, it's kind of a Pascalian wager I'm pointing here, but Lewis is asking us to ask this personal question, this practical question: should I trust God or not? And in that context, it makes sense to weigh the pros and cons. What's the gain? What's the possible loss? Very little gain from distrusting God, huge potential gain from trusting him. It makes sense to gamble on the trust instead of that. Finally, sixthly, I guess, I have a few more minutes. I think distrust in God is self-defeating, right? Because if I suppose that God is untrustworthy, well, God made us, right? He made my mind. He made my senses, right? So if he's untrustworthy, then my reasoning capacity is untrustworthy, right? It's probably leading me to all kinds of crazy ideas. So I should stop thinking. And so therefore I shouldn't pay any attention to Luis's arguments, right? Because if God is untrustworthy, then my reasoning process is untrustworthy. So the whole process here is self-defeating. We have to assume that God is trustworthy in order to continue to think, in order to continue to pursue truth, right? So therefore, this is a very special case, right? Even if I stop trusting my mother, it won't affect my ability to reason. It won't affect the plausibility of reason. But if I distrust God, yeah, it will. So I've talked about 7. I guess I've talked about 7 and 8 already, actually. I mean, would God's goodness differ from ours in certain respects? Yes, right? When he does things that are similar to what we do, like make a promise, then I think we can apply moral standards. We can say we can trust God to keep those promises. But when he's creating a world, and when he's binding himself to respect the actions of creatures in that world, That's a very different action from anything that you and I have ever done. And so it's very difficult for us to to make any kind of judgment as to what a loving God would do in that context, especially since we're not there yet to be loved. So it's a very different sort of situation. And finally, can suffering be evidence against Christianity? Again, I should drop this because Luis didn't actually take it in this direction. But I guess if you looked at what he said and thought this is in some sense evidence against Christianity, it can't really be because, I mean, if a worldview or a theory entails a certain result, and then you see that result, that confirms the theory, it doesn't disconfirm it. And Christianity teaches that terrible things will happen to good people, right? And so we see these things happening, that doesn't really disconfirm Christianity, it actually confirms it. If it turned out that terrible things never happen to innocent people, that would be a problem for Christianity, but fortunately, unfortunately, that's not the case. All right, I'll go up there.
Thank you, Dr. Kuntz. Now we'll have a reply by Professor Oliveira.
Thanks, Rob. So, I mentioned that there are different versions of the problem of evil, and different versions are making different impositions or demanding different kinds of responses. I don't think that the interesting question here is whether theism or Christianity is made logically incoherent because of evil. That's sort of like the version of the logical problem of evil, right? So I think I will grant that there's plenty of possible things that, if they're true, would reasonably explain why God has permitted evil and all sorts of kind of evil. And many of those things, I think, are things that Rob has mentioned. So I don't have any complaints about those being, possible explanations. I think the interesting question is whether those things are plausible as answers, right? That's a personal question, I think. I think that you have to weigh that for yourself. Aside from the say-so of religious authorities, aside from our desire to keep our identities from falling apart, aside from our fear of visiting the jungle outside our worldviews and so on, do we really think we have good reasons for accepting those things as true, right? So my replies here come in that spirit. I just want to point out why those answers seem implausible to me, the questions that come to my mind when I'm thinking about those answers, and highlight those questions and invite you to think seriously about those issues as well. Not suggesting that there's no answers to the questions I'm raising, but I think those are important questions for anyone to be thinking about if you're going to entertain those answers. So, why didn't God create a world full of happiness and devoid of pain? Rob suggested that this presupposes that God is aiming at a certain global outcome, but I don't see why. I don't see why that presupposes that at all. For example, suppose I know that the favorite color of all three of your children is blue. Suppose I know that you want to paint the walls in each of their rooms in their favorite color. Suppose I find out that the walls in each of their rooms has been painted red. I ask you, why didn't you paint all the walls in blue? And I'm not presupposing that you're aiming for a certain global outcome, and you telling me that I'm presupposing that makes no sense. I'm merely presupposing that you care about something about each particular person, and I have information about each of those particular people that leads to a consequence that is a global outcome. So I don't see that as settling the issue at all. Why doesn't God intervene to prevent the suffering of the individual creatures he loves? This answer to me seems to be in tension with the first answer. A commitment to sustaining a created world containing creatures with their own intrinsic natures, that's a commitment to a certain global outcome, not a commitment to the individual people. Imagine God telling a 4-year-old, I'm really sorry. I wish I could do something about your crippling suffering in this dark and sweltering and bruising mine pit. It's just that I'm really committed to constraining my actions in the world. But I really do love you as an individual. I'm not focusing on a global outcome. Those things seem to me to be in tension with each other. Are miracles then impossible? Rob tells us that they're not impossible, but they need a special justification and so on. And I'm asking, why? Who made up that rule? How is that rule an expression of God's love for individuals as individuals? Again, imagine God telling the 4-year-old British kid, I know, unfortunately, I cannot perform miracles for the sake of preventing pain and suffering. It's really out of my hands. But again, I really do love you as an individual. I just don't know why we should accept that. Are human suffering and death good things? Merely part of the cycle of life? Explanations of God's choices here that appeal to what is necessary or was necessary, they always call for close examination. As the creator of the universe, its laws, and everything else in it, God is traditionally understood to be bound only by the laws of logic itself, not by the laws of instrumental connections and limitations like that. So what reason do we have for thinking that it was logically necessary that God subject humanity to the reign of death, as opposed to a choice, a decision that wasn't logically necessary? Why was this kind of evil mandated by the laws of logic? I think we need to think a little bit more about that as well. Why did God place each of us in the midst of such a fallen, corrupted creation? Now, Rob's answer here is a claim very commonly made by secular ethicists, and it may be true, but it seems to me at least that accepting that claim might turn out costly for some Christians at least. Here's two reasons. One is that it seems to be in tension with the idea that our personal identity is determined by our souls or essences. If you think that you have a soul or an essence that God actualizes in a world, then that seems to be in tension with the idea of the essentialism about our origins. And it's also incompatible with Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. That's a reply to the logical problem of evil. At least as Plantinga articulated it, he made very specific use of the idea that God could have actualized you in many different kinds of worlds. You yourself, not someone else. So there's some cost there if you go that way. Why did God create us at all, knowing that so many of us would suffer or turn to great evil? I don't understand the idea that the act of creation is sui generis. Here's a way of bringing out what's perplexing to me. Suppose God decided to create a world that was just hell. Literally hell. Every creature brought forth lived their entire internal lives in unspeakable burning pain. This answer tells us we could not condemn that creative act as evil. That seems preposterous to me. That seems like it would be terrifically evil. Now you might say, God would never do that. He would never create a world like that. But why not? If he had no prior obligations, and if our moral categories like good and evil don't apply to his creation, then on what basis can we guess what he would and wouldn't do? It seems to me that we do apply those categories, and we would think that would be a horrible thing to do. Why didn't God create a better world? I don't quite understand this answer either. Is a suggestion here that God created an inferior world with suckers like us in it just for the sake of variety? I don't understand. I don't know. I feel like there needs to be a reason and a justification for bringing people into existence in certain conditions, and I don't see what is the reason that we're getting here. Do the imperfections of this world reflect an imperfection in God? I think the claim that there could always be a better world, that might be true, but I think it's not really relevant. What's relevant is that there's still a difference in this infinite line of worlds, from worst to best, or from bad to good, between worlds that are good and worlds that are bad, even if the boundaries between them might be vague. But you can still say that some worlds are horrible. The hell world I talked about is a horrible world. A world of the angelic creatures is a great world, and you can order the worlds infinitely if you want. But the question is, doesn't the fact that God chose to create a world so far down this line reflect badly on him? Right? And that doesn't get into any problem about God's perfections and the infinite possibilities with respect to the worlds. The idea that God needs no reason not to do something, I don't see how this claim fits with the picture of God, of a God that loves and cares for me as an individual. Again, suppose God creates the hell world I mentioned above. Suppose he decides to do nothing towards each of its inhabitants. He just watches them suffer forever. This answer now is telling us that we could not condemn this submission as evil. That seems wrong to me. It seems that that would be horrifically evil as well. It would be bad to create that world. It would be bad to not do anything as well. There are omissions that call for justifying reasons, and that seems like one of them. So Rob mentions that he's not denying that God has done amazing things for us. He asks us not to focus on the negative. I don't find that persuasive. Suppose John is the perfect husband by every measure that matters to Julie, except that once a year he cheats on her with a random stranger. Julie hates this part, but John reminds her, stop focusing on this one thing. I've done amazing things for you in our relationship. I shower good things on you in our relationship daily. Why are you so focused on the negative? It's irrelevant, the other stuff. If we're talking about things that are really bad, the suffering of the children in the mines or an infidelity like this, it doesn't matter the rest. We're talking about a reason, an explanation for that particular thing. Okay. Finally, what positive meaning does suffering have? Rob mentions very traditionally, of course, God conquered evil through suffering and so on and so on. I don't know. Why does God need our help in his warfare with evil? Logically speaking. Did he or did he not conquer evil with his suffering? What's the holdup? Thank you.
Well, thank you to Luis, and thank you to Rob for a very stimulating presentation. So we're going to move on to Q&A. So remember, here in your programs, you should be able to access a vet portal to be able to ask questions. So be sure to ask your questions. We've got a number of them already right here. So I'm going to kick it off here with a question for Rob Koons. Rob, so how does suffering at a global scale, like war, express love for the individual? It seems as if the individual is lost for the larger suffering.
Yeah, so again, if God permitted war for the sake of some good for the individuals involved, I think that'd be problematic, right? That's the kind of theodicy I really oppose, because then, how could I fight for peace if wars, when they happen, are part of God's plan, right? But if wars are simply the result of human error, human sin, right? And they happen just because God doesn't intervene, right, directly. Because if he did, then we wouldn't be able to have morally significant action. In fact, there wouldn't be any action at all. Right? There'd only be God pushing little markers around, right, without any intrinsic natures of their own. So God leaves it to us. Why does he need our cooperation? Because that's the kind of world he's created, in which he's not going to intervene directly to solve these problems. He's rather going to offer us spiritual help to fight them ourselves. That's the kind of world he created. You can say, well, why didn't he create a different world? Well, is this a bad world? I don't think so. It's not. I guess the one thing where I would qualify the statement that I made, and Lewis was right to press on me on this, is that I do want to say that when God creates, he only creates good things. So he doesn't create. He wouldn't create. Even the devil wasn't created evil, right? So he only. And I don't know if that's a moral issue, but it's more of a metaphysical one, I think, right? A good God is only going to create good things. So he creates good things, but these good things are capable of acting badly, right? And then that's how evil results. In a sense, I guess I'm denying the opacity to some extent, right? I'm saying, look, there's a perfectly clear reason why he does, namely, this person made this bad choice. This person decided to drop these bombs. This person, did this. So they're perfectly. I'll give exactly the same explanations in a way that the naturalists will give for these evils. They happen because of things that God created, acting in the way they did.
Thanks, thanks, Dr. Kuhn. So the next one is sort of along these lines for Dr. Oliveira. If God gave us free will, does he not have to tolerate the consequences of our free will?
He may have to. There's two different issues here. One is the question of how much or in which cases of our exercise of free will God must tolerate for us to continue to count as having free will. It doesn't seem true that if God intervenes once with you, he has removed your free will, or twice or three times. So there's maybe a threshold issue. It's a complicated question of what would be compatible with your free will in general or not. But the issue I'm pressing is separate from having to insist that God could have created us with a free will and stopping our actions, our evil actions. The evil I'm pressing is rather, the issue I'm pressing is rather a consistency or compatibility issue with the other claims that you might want to make about God. Because it might be perfectly true that God could not have created us with free will and prevented all the evil that we do and so on. And what I want to say then is that if that is true, then we should just stop or qualify our claims that God is perfectly loving and caring towards us as individuals. We should rather say that God has other concerns in mind, for example, maintaining this global feature of creatures with free will for whatever reason, and that trumps his care and concern for individuals as individuals. That's the claim that I'm pushing, is that it's perfectly fine to say that God allows evil because of our free will, and it may be even required of God to do so. It's just not fitting to then say that he cares for the individual and loves the individual as an individual in the same way that we do when we talk about loving and caring for the individual.
Thank you. So the next one is for Dr. Koons. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the role you think the afterlife plays in thinking about the problem of evil. So you mentioned that towards the end of the talk, so if you might just speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely touches on the question of God's love and concern and the trustworthiness of God. So, so what God has promised is that if we cooperate with his grace, that he will give us eternal life, right? And that seems to me a very great expression of love and concern for us as individuals, right? So if you have questions about whether he does love us, I mean, here's pretty conclusive evidence that he does, right? But if I could respond to the point Luis just made, if that's all right. So there are these things in ethics that are called deontic constraints or deontological constraints. These are things that, for instance, if I make a promise, that I then more or less have to keep that promise regardless of its consequences, at least up to some point. So if I promise to meet with a student on one afternoon, and that means I have to miss one of my son's baseball games, right? Does that show a lack of love and concern for my son? I don't think so, right? Because I was constrained by that promise not to go to the football game, right? And so or baseball game. So in a similar way, if God is constrained deontically from interference in the world, and as a result of that deontic constraint, he doesn't solve this immediate suffering that we're having, but he does offer us eternal life, right? That seems to me to be, it's understandable for us, right? How that's compatible with his genuinely being good and genuinely loving us. He's obeying deontic constraints so we can understand. Again, they're going to apply differently in God's case, but we can understand the basic category that's involved.
Thank you. This one is for Dr. Oliveira. So in thinking about several of the arguments that you made, this questioner is asking, how are you understanding good, right? In terms of relationships and exchanges and expectations, how would you understand good?
I don't know. I'm prepared to say how I'm thinking of evil, but good. I don't know. The arguments I'm making here, notice, don't require that I stipulate a specific understanding of good or view of what good is. The arguments I'm making are supposed to work for you, given your views on good, given your views of what it means to love and care for someone, if the arguments work at all, right? My claim is that, however you understand love and care, when you say that God loves and cares for you or for his creatures, you are saying that God does something very similar to what you do. Right? You're saying that God relates towards you or acts towards you or has dispositions towards you that are similar to however you think of those things. And then I'm suggesting that those expectations are overwhelmingly unmet throughout the history of the world, and that creates some problems. But I don't think my argument turns on a particular definition of good, mine or anyone else's. It's about an internal tension that you will have given your view of it and given your experience with God. I don't know what a good, the question in general, abstractly, what is good? I don't know that question, how to answer that question, or what is a good relationship or a good friendship. Those seem also very particular and subjective matters that I don't think relate to the argument that I was presenting.
Thank you. So this one's for Dr. Koons. So, Dr. Koons, you made reference to this kind of absolute unconditional trust, right? That you were arguing we need to have towards God and even towards spouses and parents or stuff like this. So, how would you think about that in the face of what might seem to be like extremely overpowering evidence of wrongdoing on their part, especially in the human cases?
Yeah. So I mean, clearly, I think it's clear. It's easier in the case of God, in my view, because if there is a God, it's metaphysically impossible that he would do bad, that he would do evil, that he would fail to love, and so there's no risk, if that means objective, factual risk, so to speak, in that case. Whereas I guess even my mother, it's potentially possible that she should be corrupted and do something bad, but. Yeah, I guess it's a question of the nature of a good human society. What's involved in that, right? Should we relate to each other in such a way that I'm always sort of double checking to see, are you living up to the standards I expect? And if not, then I'm going to withdraw some of the trust. Or are there at least certain cases where, I know this person well enough already now that I've passed over a kind of Rubicon, right? So that now any evidence you provide for me, to the contrary, I'm going to say it's got to be wrong, right? Mm. It's more likely that evidence is wrong than that this person would fail me in these sorts of ways, in these sort of extreme ways. And I think that's a good thing, right? I think that's a positive thing for human society that we're capable of that. Could it in some cases be abused? Sure. And maybe that would result in some very bad results. But even so, even in the face of that, I'd still say it's good that we're capable of that kind of faith.
Yeah, that's great.
Can I say something about
Please,
that?
please.
So I agree with Rob on that. And I wasn't suggesting that trusting others is a bad thing or that we should be checking. The cases I'm talking about are cases where there's been a series of very long and overwhelming experience of the expectations of that trust not being met.
Apparently not being met.
Yeah, apparently not being met. And not on the say-so of someone, right? And you seeing it, you experiencing them as apparently not being met and so on. So I'm not just talking about someone, saying something about your wife or your mother or you thinking of one or two things that you don't understand. I'm talking about cases where it is just overwhelmingly unclear to you why they are doing what they're doing, given how you think of them. So I think those cases are compatible, that the fact that that's a bad thing is compatible with the thought that it's a good thing in general to trust and to be resilient in your trust.
That's great.
And you think it would be always bad in that case to continue to trust the person, rather than think that maybe I'm misinterpreting what they're doing. I'm getting a very partial view, and I should.
Well, I mean, it's a degree issue here now, right? Yeah. But what I said is that it is at least recklessly dangerous if it gets too bad, the normative unintelligibility, and it goes from being just the worthwhile danger of trust to a reckless. I don't know what's the cutoff point for that, and the issue about God, when you mention if God exists, then there's no risk. That's not quite right, right? It's if God exists and is good, then there is no risk. But to say that God is good is just another way of ascribing values and concerns to God. So the very thing that is at stake here is whether God is good in those ways.
But I might have good metaphysical reasons for thinking that that's impossible.
Sure.
In
So
God's case.
I wonder if I could have both of you comment on kind of a certain line of reasoning that I don't think has played much of a role in the conversation here, but that often gets some airtime in conversations of the problem of evil. So if people ask, for example, hey, we've mentioned freedom a lot here. So it's like, well, so what's so great about freedom? Like, here's a kind of stock answer. What's so great about freedom? Love. Only freedom allows you to love. That's one thought. Second thought, we might think about something like the well-known phenomenon of like adversarial growth. It's like, hey, I've gone through these extremely challenging circumstances, and what do you know, at the end of it, I didn't see it at the time, but it's like, wow, I've grown so much out of this, and I've learned things that I couldn't have learned otherwise. So I was wondering, it's a kind of very standard way of thinking about responses to the problem of evil, so I was just wondering if both of you might comment a little bit on this. So, Professor Oliver, I could ask you to.
Sure. What's so great about freedom? Well, this is America. What kind of question is that? No, well, more seriously, I think there's lots of good things about freedom. The issue is that we're getting, when you ask that question, we're getting close to what Rob was mentioning about thinking about instrumental justifications for evil, that the reason God allows evil is because of its connection, its instrumental connection to some great good like freedom or something else. And I agree with Rob that that's problematic, and I agree that for the very same reasons that will lead us to conclude that we ourselves should allow and perhaps perpetrate all sorts of things because they will eventually lead or necessarily lead to great goods if God permits them. So it's complicated, I think, to think of the connection between freedom as a justification for evil for that reason. The issue is not whether freedom is good or what is the value of freedom. The issue is, even given that freedom is good and important and connected to all those great goods, the idea that God would permit something because it's instrumentally connected to a great good is itself problematic. And so I think the theist is better served by thinking of God's justification in other ways.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because it helps me clarify that I wouldn't argue that God is allowing this evil for the sake of some future good involving freedom, let's say. It's rather that in order to create a world at all, God has to enter into, again, what I would call deontological constraints of some kind, to allow creatures to do their own thing, so to speak. Freedom is one special case of that, important case. But even rocks and bodies of water have their own kind of autonomy too, right, that God respects, right? So it's not a global thing. It's not some kind of good that he's trying to pursue. It's just except, I guess, at the very beginning, if he's going to create a world at all, he's got to do so under some kind of deontological constraints. And then when people misuse that freedom, right, that's just bad, right? He's not allowing that for the sake of some future good. It's simply a consequence of his creating a world at all in the first place.
Yeah, so I'll just add that I don't disagree with that at all as an explanation. Again, my point has been that if you think that, then I worry about the consistency of continuing to claim that God loves and cares for people personally and so on. It's just that if that's the view, then whatever we're saying about God's personal love and care is something very different from what we mean when we talk about loving and caring personally for someone. And that's a perfectly consistent view. But
yeah, I mean, I think we haven't talked about the principle of analogy yet either, right? So when we attribute love to God, let's say, and to a human parent, I think we're attributing the same thing, but but they're going to manifest themselves in different ways because of the ontological difference between the two beings, right? I mean, as wonderful as my wife is, the whole of existence doesn't depend on her, right? and so if she were to break one of her own promises, it's not like everything would just dissolve, right, into nothingness. Whereas I don't know what it would mean for God to violate his own integrity, right? He can't do that, no matter how much he would care about this particular child that's suffering. So we do have to adjust our expectations in this kind of metaphysical way, I think.
Yeah, but I do think that it's easy to fall back into the idea that what we mean by God loving and caring is exactly what we ordinarily mean. And I think it does, if you're following your, this very Thomistic line of thought, I'm assuming that we ascribe these properties to God by analogy. Strictly speaking, we mean something fairly different from what we mean when, especially you're talking about, when we say that we love our spouses or our children and so on, and we say God loves us. I suspect that most people are not attuned or thinking very carefully that they mean something significantly different from when they say that.
Yeah, and the word mean itself is kind of means different things. So I want to say in one sense we do mean exactly the same thing. And that's what people have in mind. But the behavioral implications of that are different. That's my point.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a question for Dr. Kuhn. So does the world that God create include heaven and hell? If so, then is not hell world real, and there are souls who are in endless pain and so no redemption?
Yeah, so hell's a difficult subject, obviously. There are lots of different ways of thinking about hell. My own conception of it is, as C.S. Lewis puts it, that the doors are bolted from the inside, so to speak. That is, it's not so much that God is inflicting hell upon people, it's rather that people insist on that as their choice over heaven, right? As I guess, who is it? Is it Milton, Satan, who wants to rather rule in hell than serve in heaven, right? So it's, and as I think Chesterton put it, hell is God's last complement to free will. So if someone insists on having their own way and not submitting to God's rulership, then God will respect that. And that's the essence of hell in my picture. There's a lot more to be said about it, obviously, but that'll suffice for now, I hope.
This next questioner for Dr. Oliveira asks about whether there isn't, in thinking about what God does or doesn't do, isn't there a kind of limitation of knowledge? And this questioner raises the example of like, hey, I love my kid, I make him do his homework, he hates it, but I know that it's good for him. So how would you respond to a case like that, right?
I was presuming that that's true. That was the setup for my discussion, was the belief that God does have justifying reasons and the belief that we don't know what those justifying reasons are, that he does have, right? So I was presuming precisely the analogous situation to a parent who knows what's best for their child and the child who does not understand why they're being inflicted this horrific suffering of doing homework. So, I think that is a fairly widespread and well-motivated way of thinking about our relationship to God. So nothing I said is in tension with that being the case. What I was suggesting is that once we think more carefully about what that entails, we might be led to some complicated conclusions. But I wasn't denying the situation or the relationship being described like that at all.
Great. So the next one's for Dr. Kuhn's here. So you said God won't intervene in all circumstances, but rarely. So this question is asking to get a little bit clearer about this. Can you provide a current example of that in contemporary life or even in the past 100 years?
Well, yeah, so, I believe that there are ongoing miracles. And some people do experience miraculous healings. I just read recently about a friend of mine, Tom Holland, who's a very famous historian, not a believer actually, but
It's not Spider-Man. Not Tom Holland, the Spider-Man. The Tom Holland, the
a
historian.
different Tom Holland, actually, the one who's a famous Cambridge historian.
Just to be clear.
He experienced through prayer a sort of miraculous healing. So I think that happens. So, when God decides what kind of world to create, I think, this is very anthropomorphic at this point, obviously, so it has to do something like this to make sense of it. He had to, I think, again, he had to put himself under some deontic constraints in order to create a world that would have its own autonomy, right? But those constraints could be somewhat porous, right? And he could decide that under certain kinds of circumstances he would intervene. But again, it can't be that just if there's suffering, I'll intervene, right? Because that would be, to in effect, completely obliterate the autonomy of the creation, right? So it has to be much more. They have to be exceptional cases rather than explicit ones. Now, I don't know exactly what those rules are that he set up, right? There's good reason for him not to tell us what they are, because basically it would sort of hand over control of the universe to us, and there's good reason for him not to do that. I know that things like prayer can make a difference, and so I'm very motivated to pray for people when they're in difficulties. But I don't think it always makes a difference. Lots of times it doesn't make a difference. Maybe most of the time it doesn't. Now, again, you might think, well, why couldn't God have made a world where there were more exceptions, right, than he did? Well, again, two reasons. One is he might have, but then you and I wouldn't be there because our origins are essentially tied to this world with this set of rules, so to speak, right? So it's not a lack of love for us that he doesn't have more exceptions in these rules, right? And the other thing is, I mean, there's no principled cutoff point here, right? So he didn't have to have a reason to pick some particular point rather than another. He just picked a point that's good and that's reasonable, and that's what he did. There's no best world again, right, for him to pick.
Sure. For Dr. Oliveira, so this questioner is in effect asking you to comment on traditional arguments for God's existence. So he or she asks, if not God, then what or who? How do you make sense of the existence at all?
I don't know. Well, I'm not arguing that God does not exist.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. So that I hoped that was clear. I'm not arguing that God does not exist, that a powerful being does not exist, that a prime mover unmoved does not exist, that I can accept the cosmological argument, I can accept fairly traditional arguments for the existence of God and still give the presentation that I gave. Not all traditional arguments, obviously, but the claim I was making was a claim about, what could be taken as a claim about the kind of God, the character of God, but more precisely, it's a claim about our relationship to God and some of the difficulties of that relationship, right? So nothing I said implies or suggests that God, as the creator of the world, the reason for our existence and so on, does not exist. So that aside from that being compatible with what I said, my own views here, I'm entirely agnostic about that kind of claim. I don't particularly have any strong beliefs about the character or the existence of this God, this prime mover unmoved. I don't have particularly strong beliefs that this God does not exist. It seems to me that both positions, the strong theistic position and the strong atheistic position, are metaphysically extravagant views that make claims or take strong stances on things that I think are far beyond what we should be taking strong stances on. So I'm indifferent or agnostic about that claim, but strictly speaking, nothing that I said here is suggesting that God does not exist or in tension with the idea that God exists.
So could you just say a little bit more about that in terms of both, as you understand, in both the traditional theist position and the atheistic position, making extravagant claims? Could you say a little bit more about that?
What I mean by extravagant claims here, the extravagant metaphysical claim is to postulate or affirm or be confident in the existence of a being like God, be it the traditionally conceived Christian God as a perfectly good, perfectly powerful, omniscient, and so on, or even more properties, immutable, and those kinds of claims seem to me to go beyond any evidence that I find compelling or suggestive enough to call for assent. But equally so, it seems to me that a strong belief or a confident belief that there is no such being is equally going beyond what the evidence or what the reasons that we have, the arguments that we have suggest, right? I think that the cosmological argument is not a silly argument that can be dismissed by anyone who is modestly intelligent. I don't think that the fine-tuning argument is an argument can be easily dismissed by anyone that's mildly intelligent. I just don't think that those arguments lead us straightforwardly to any particularly substantive view of God, and I don't think that those arguments are overwhelmingly compelling either. So both views, I think, overstep what we should be thinking about it. I think we should be open to the possibility of both.
Sure. So Dr. Kuntz, this questioner asks, can the problem of evil be answered satisfactorily without recourse to faith? So this questioner is especially thinking about Alyosha in the Brothers Karamazov and being unable to say yes to human creation, right? For those of you who haven't read the Brothers K, you should go out and read it. It's great.
Right. Yeah. Well, as Louis said, there are many different problems of evil. So some can and some can't. So I think I would say, I'm very interested in these sort of natural theological, metaphysical arguments that Luis is mentioning. I don't think they will get you a loving God necessarily, right? I think they'll get you a good God in the sense that I can't make sense of this being, this sort of absolutely perfect being, having bad intentions, right? What would that make any sense? Because I think of badness in privative terms. Badness is always falling short somehow of an ideal, and so I think God would certainly be innocent and have only good intentions. But to then make the further step that God loves me or you, that's a pretty big jump metaphysically, right? So there, I think you do need something like faith and the revelation of God in Christ in particular and in the Bible is really essential to that, in my view.
So I wonder, Dr. Kuntz, if you could say a little bit more about that, because I think one of the questions that's been kind of pretty front and center here is how do we think about God being loving to individuals, right? And yeah. Dr. Oliveira has been really pressing the point. It's like, wow, you might believe in some kind of higher being, but it sure as heck doesn't seem loving from what we seem to be taking as ordinary standards of relationships. So I wonder if you might speak a little bit more about how you understand God being loving to individuals.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point that Luis is pressing, right? A child is suffering from cancer or is being abused by a step-parent or something like that. It's horrible, right? And you think, how can God sit up there in heaven and do nothing, right, if he truly loves this child? Any human person who loves them would do something, right? And even if they promised not to do it or, there was some very strong deontological constraint, they'd say to hell with that and they'd help the child, right? So that points to the fact that there is a difference behaviorally, so to speak, if I can put it that way, between God's love and human love. And a reasonable person sort of takes that into account, that I'm going to expect the kind of love from God that's appropriate from God, right? Given, you might say, the burden of being God. In a way, that's a kind of a burdensome thing, just precisely because he's the one that's responsible for the whole creation in the first place, right? In a way that you and I are not. We just sort of find ourselves in this world, and I make a promise, I break it. Well, so what? I can make up for it in various ways. God can't break a promise, right? That would fundamentally violate the structure of reality or something, right? So we have to adjust our expectations in appropriate sort of ways, and we have to ask, well, what could God do then to demonstrate his love for this child who's suffering this terrible way? Well, he might become a human being and reveal himself, and he might provide us with grace that would enable this child and others to enjoy him eternally, and so on. So there are things that he might do that I think would be decisive demonstrations of his love, despite this apparent silence or inactivity, or as I call it, indolence that he shows in these cases.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
So, again, my issue is with the flexibility of this notion of love and care, right? That how much tension or stress can we put on it to continue to call God loving and caring when He's allowing, something horrific to happen to a child? You say that God cannot break a promise, but any plausible deontological theory, in my view at least, unless you're going to accept some very rigid Kantian position, allows that there are different kinds of promises, and the deontic constraints that are raised by promises can be trumped or outweighed by severely horrific consequences being in the offing and so on. So we all seem to agree that there are certain kinds of horrific things that even if you have made a promise, it's not just that humans would break the promise because we are weak-willed or morally unfit, it's because we recognize that sometimes breaking promises is the moral thing to do to prevent something horrible. So it doesn't seem to me enough to simply say that God cannot break a promise. It seems to me that if God is moral, sometimes He Himself would recognize that breaking a promise is what's morally called for.
Yeah, so I guess this is where we differ. I think that Kant's view is right about God, not about us, but he's right about God, that God should be super strict about these things. And it's at least intelligible, right? It seems to me that if I say, yeah, God's good, He's not doing anything because He has this deontic constraint, you can at least understand comparable situations, maybe on a different scale, with different intensity in the human realm, right? So I'm not worshiping the devil here. I'm not worshiping being whose intentions are just purely evil, or who acts in this way for no reason whatsoever. So I think that I think I've met your constraint about that it shouldn't be completely different, right? As you said in your slide, right? There's a continuity between our expectations of humans and that of God, even though there are also differences.
Well, that might be just about all the time we have. I hope that the conversation I've been stimulating, and if it's not stimulating, at least a means to a great reception afterwards. So please join us for a reception. But just before I send you over in that direction, just a couple of notes of thank yous before we finish. So first off, thank you to Luis and Rob for a very stimulating conversation. A couple of other thank yous in order. So thanks also to James Prather, our Director of Operations, for all his hard work in helping to put this debate together. Thank you also to our intern Sean Sullivan, our student volunteers, especially our HI Student Club president, Janvi, who's back over here. Janvi, say hello. Delighted to have you. Thank you for your work. Thank you also for all in the HI board of directors, especially Mark Dulworth, our chair, and finally thank you all for helping make a success our second annual debate. Be in the lookout for our debate in the fall. If you like more of this, please check out our website. You can sign up for a mailing list and find out about other ways to participate in and support our mission. You'll see here that in addition to the QR code for questions, there's also a lovely QR code for support. So if you like events like this, there's a way in which you can encourage us to make them happen. But that is it. That's all I have for you tonight. So thank you all. Thank you. And please join us for a reception right straight back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Being involved.
Absolutely.